The traditional disputes of philosophers are, for the most part, as unwarranted as they are unfruitful. This was the bold claim made by British philosopher Ayer in the opening lines of his book, Language, Truth and Logic. The work is a fantastic assassination of traditional philosophy, as it accuses most of it as being pointless, useless, and most of all, meaningless. Ayer is like a crucible, burning away the parts of philosophy that he considered to be just idle imaginings to get to a beautiful new discipline underneath, one that prioritizes logic and clear thinking above all else. In this video, we'll learn why most of philosophy might be literally meaningless, how unclear ideas can waste your time, and how we can all learn to be a bit more logical in our thinking. This video is going to get very analytic and quite technical, but I really encourage you to stick around to the end. On a personal note, this book was the very thing that got me into philosophy, and I hope that by the end of this video, you will understand why. But in order to truly get what Ayer says, we need a little bit of background. And for that, we must travel back to early 20th century Europe and the capital of the intellectual world, Vienna. 1. A crisis in philosophy. Have you ever got the idea that philosophy is just a bit fishy as far as the discipline goes? Perhaps you've heard a philosopher assert with confidence that the external world is just not real, or that other people don't exist, and you've thought, that just sounds off. Well, you are certainly not alone in this instinct. Towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, philosophy had taken on what Ayer might charitably call intellectual bloat, and what he might uncharitably call a load of old nonsense. It had become popular to assert that, despite appearances, the world was actually non-existent and simply made up of ideas. And a great many thinkers were occupied with ambitious metaphysical projects. These philosophers asserted that there were truths much more fundamental than those of science, and they could be uncovered by a vaguely defined metaphysical intuition. But any movement has its counter-movement, and a group of philosophers who chose to criticize this line of thinking were called the Vienna Circle. These were an extraordinary bunch of philosophers, scientists and mathematicians who got together with the aim of making philosophy a respectable discipline for the modern age. They were deeply skeptical of the sort of metaphysics that had characterized late 19th century European thinking, and they wanted to move philosophy forward in a way that was entirely compatible with modern science. They called themselves the logical empiricists, but they were largely known to the rest of the world as the logical positivists. One of the temporary members was the young Wittgenstein, and his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus was a key text for the group for many years. It is at this stage that Ayer travels to Vienna and begins to attend some of the meetings of the Vienna Circle, and he is excited and relieved to meet people who think like he does. He wants to philosophize in the vein of someone like David Hume, who disregarded metaphysics as pointless and instead pursued a mixture of deeply logical reasoning and empirical investigations. Above all, Ayer became even more convinced of his view on metaphysics in his time in Vienna. He saw it as a blight on what could otherwise be a brilliant discipline, and he sat down to write a philosophical treatise against it. That treatise, Language, Truth and Logic, has since become legendary amongst philosophers for its unforgiving, incisive critique, and for popularizing a philosophy whose influence is still clear to this day. Ayer's great book is one attempt to rehome philosophy by stripping it of everything that he considered to be a waste of time, and reclaiming what he saw was the core of philosophy: rigorous, logical analysis of important ideas. In other words, he wanted to replace mystical metaphysics with the study of language, truth, and logic. And he did this all through the application of a simple principle, one that changed the face of philosophy forever. 2. The verification principle. If I told you that there was a cat currently in my room, but that it was invisible, intangible, and never did anything to affect the world, this claim would seem in some sense off. It is sort of unclear what my statement really amounts to. The cat can never affect reality, we can never observe it, and its existence never allows us to predict anything. Compare this with a statement like all men are mortal. You can make predictions from this claim. Everyone in your life is going to die at some point is one of them, as is, if Socrates is a man, then he is mortal. As a result, this seems to be a substantial claim in the way that my statement about my invisible, intangible cat is not. And Ayer helps us understand why claims about my magical cat seem suspicious. They are unverifiable. Now, Ayer has a very special definition of unverifiable, which is similar to the one we use in everyday language, but is much more precise. He says that a statement is verifiable if there is some possible observation that can contribute to its truth or falsity. In other words, if it, together with some other verifiable statements, can allow us to make some predictions about the world. A statement is unverifiable just if this is not the case. This is all a bit abstract, so let's bring it down to earth. My statement about my cat cannot, even in principle, be confirmed by observation. You could conduct every empirical test you wanted, and you would not come up with any evidence for or against the existence of my cat. On the other hand, we can test the statement all men are mortal by observing men and seeing if they keel over at some point. If they do, this is an observation that supports our statement. The suspect nature of unverifiable claims had already been observed by philosophers like David Hume, but Ayer went one step further and said that these statements are not just off or iffy, but that they are literally meaningless. He did not just say that we can't know whether these statements are true or false. He argued that they literally did not say anything about the world. They were empty gestures, which might be evocative or pleasant, but were, strictly speaking, nonsense. This goes a long way to explaining our natural reaction to statements like the one about my mystical feline friend. We don't want to say that's wrong because we can't disprove it, nor do we want to say that's right because we have no evidence for it. We don't even want to say that we could never know either way, because that allows us to get tied up in talking about all sorts of things that may or may not exist. What we want to say is something like what Ayer says, which is, you are talking nonsense. Ayer is allowed to make this philosophical move because he has a very interesting view on language. He thinks that when we make statements about the world, what we're trying to do is describe actual or potential observations. So when we say all men are mortal, we're basically saying something like, if you watch a man long enough, they will die. This is because Ayer sees the point of descriptive language as allowing us to interact with the world and predict what is going to happen. So, if you have statements that don't allow you to make predictions, like my invisible, intangible cat is on my desk, then those statements are not, strictly speaking, descriptive. For Ayer, they may be many things, but as a factual claim about the world, they are nonsense. But Ayer does say there's another type of statement that has literal meaning, and these are tautologies. We might call them logical truths or analytic truths. They're essentially propositions that are true by definition. So, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a tautology, because it is part of the definition of 2 that when you add 2 to it, it becomes 4. Likewise, all triangles have 3 sides is literally meaningful because it is tautological. It is true by definition. On the flip side, triangles don't have 3 sides is also a meaningful statement because it is necessarily false. It is a contradiction. You can probably guess here that the overall intuition is that for a statement to be literally meaningful, for it to say something with factual or philosophical significance, there must be some theoretical way of telling whether it's true or false. This can either be through observation in the case of verifiable statements, or through a careful logical analysis of definitions, as in the case of potential tautologies. This is a little technical, but it boils down to a really simple idea. If you cannot observe it or prove it with logic, then it is nonsense. The funny thing is, if we accept this principle, we render a whole chunk of what is traditionally considered philosophy, as well as other fields, as literally meaningless. And this radical consequence is just what we're going to explore next. If you want more videos like this, then consider subscribing to my Patreon. The link is in the description. 3. The Victims of Verificationism. Most of Language, Truth and Logic is an extended takedown of different fields of philosophy. Ayer first marches in to destroy metaphysics, before turning to ethics and aesthetics, and finally taking a sledgehammer to much of philosophy of religion. It would be bold to make strong claims about any one of these fields, but Ayer tackles all 3 at just 25 years old. The first field up against the firing squad of facts and logic is metaphysics. Metaphysics is basically all unverifiable claims, and it's like this by design. It is the field of philosophy that is aimed at uncovering fundamental truths about the world. Fundamental here means truths that go beyond science or even the observable world altogether, to get at some sort of ultimate reality. If you've heard claims that the world isn't real or that everything is fundamentally one substance, you have heard metaphysics. Claims like this are obvious targets of Ayer's verification principle because almost by definition they are unverifiable. If there were any possible observation that could confirm or deny a metaphysical claim, then it would cease to be metaphysics, and it would become, well, science. Already, this gets rid of a lot of philosophy that people find spurious. It purges the field of the sorts of idle, unevidenced thought-wandering that make many people dismiss it as pointless. In Ayer's view, many claims from philosophy of religion also fall under this banner, as statements about a transcendental God are also unverifiable, and so literally meaningless in his view. Interestingly enough, many theologians have responded to Ayer by claiming that many statements about God actually are verifiable, even if they're only verifiable post-death. But either way, Ayer is not done yet. Next, he turns his rifle to face ethics and aesthetics. If we're to take an ethical statement like murder is wrong at face value, it ascribes a transcendental property of being wrong to an action, murder. But then we encounter a problem. How do we verify whether murder is wrong? If we were to investigate a crime scene, we would never find this property of being wrong. People may argue that murder is wrong, but there's nothing in the world that can verify or falsify this claim of immorality. As a result, Ayer says that if we interpret ethical claims in this way, they are, strictly speaking, meaningless. So we need some other account of what people are doing when they call something right or wrong. And this is where Ayer reinterprets all of our moral statements as emotive expressions. So instead of interpreting murder is wrong as saying that murder has some property of wrongness, we instead interpret it as someone expressing their displeasure at the concept of murder. This view of ethical statements is called emotivism, and it comes with a whole host of philosophical benefits and problems. But Ayer argues quite persuasively for it, using his radical verification principle. As you can imagine, an analogous argument is given regarding statements like, "This is beautiful." In his view, the principle thus achieves its aim of cleansing philosophy of what many consider to be pointless or suspicious activities. No longer will it indulge in claims about the metaphysical world that do not amount to anything observable, nor will it attempt to find these mysterious properties of right and wrong. But this begs the question, what will philosophy actually do? And this is just what we will move on to next. 4. A new philosophy. It is tempting to see Ayer's view on philosophy as the field admitting defeat. Philosophy has been shown to be an outdated and useless discipline, and it should hang up its hat and walk off into the sunset. Now, both myself and Ayer obviously have a vested interest in this not being the case, and I'm happy to reassure you that there are plenty of areas of philosophy left entirely untouched by Ayer's criticism. The first is that philosophy can still do its classic job of logical clarification and elucidation. How many arguments do you have with people where you just feel like you're talking past one another? Often, that is because you're using different definitions of the key terms of a debate. For instance, if to me, science means a collection of natural laws and methods of empirical investigation, and to you, science means a particular set of research institutions, then if we have a disagreement about the role of science in society, it won't be a real disagreement, since we might have only come into conflict because we're using the same word in different ways. Philosophy's focus on logical investigations and precise definitions can alert us to this fact and help us have genuinely productive discussions, something I'm sure all of us can agree is in short supply. Then there is the matter of logical consequence. One of my favourite branches of philosophy is logic, and Ayer places logic at the centre of his brand new and improved philosophical discipline. If properly trained in logic, philosophers can become experts at spotting the consequences of arguments, and can see if the arguments are valid or if they're all just smoke and mirrors. And surely, if there is something the internet has taught us, it's that logical reasoning and clear thinking are desperately needed. Logic was my focus for most of my time at university, and it has made it so much easier to tell when an argument is worth taking on board and when it is invalid or unsound. Those are some of the tasks that Ayer sees in store for his new philosophy. But it's worth noting that there's another area that remains unscathed by the verification principle. This is what I like to call philosophically informed advice. On this channel, I look at a lot of thinkers like Dostoevsky, or existential philosophers like Nietzsche or Jean-Paul Sartre. Statements by thinkers like these can often be construed as forms of context-dependent wisdom. So you might spot yourself relating to a Dostoevsky protagonist and recognize that continuing on your current path will make you unhappy. Or Nietzsche's criticism of morality might make you realize that you're deeply scared of your own power. These are not the sort of universal proclamations made by metaphysicians, nor are they logical statements. They instead form a sort of intellectual toolkit that can help you navigate life. The Stoic advice to recognize that one day your loved ones will die is meant to be a tool for cultivating a particular attitude. It is not necessarily meant as a moral claim nor as an empirical law, and it's certainly not tautological. This means it is unclear if Ayer would recognize it as literally meaningful, but it is undeniable that people find this sort of philosophy helpful. It is arguably the most popular form of philosophy around today, and I think Ayer's criticism does not touch this form of thinking, because it makes no claim to be universally true in the way that metaphysics does. I personally see a lot of existential philosophy through this lens, and I find it very helpful as a way to gain useful pieces of wisdom without taking on board any unnecessary metaphysics. But despite the clarity and utility of Ayer's philosophy, there are a number of criticisms you can make of it, and here we will explore just a few of those. 5. The problems of verificationism. 10 years after writing Language, Truth and Logic, Ayer wrote an appendix to the book that admitted that he was perhaps a little bit overconfident in some of his claims. He did not anticipate his work becoming one of the most popular philosophy books of the 20th century, and he received perhaps a little bit more of a response than he was expecting. So, just in case your cousin starts spouting off verificationist talking points next Christmas dinner, it feels only fair to look at a few potential responses. The first is that it is surprisingly hard to come up with a clear definition of the verification principle. Ayer tries a number of different formulations formulations, and each time they either end up being so stringent that they render statements about history meaningless, or so lenient that they allow all the metaphysics back into philosophy. It seems that although there is definitely something in the idea that unverifiable statements are philosophically dodgy, it is difficult to give a precise definition of what unverifiable amounts to here. And secondly, there is a problem with the verification principle. It is itself unverifiable. The verificationist wants to say unverifiable claims are not literally meaningful. But in what way can this claim be verified? It seems the verificationist has been caught in their own web. By trying to exclude unverifiable statements from philosophy, they have themselves utilized an unverifiable statement. The verificationist has become a philosophical hypocrite. Unless they can come up with some way of verifying the principle or rendering it a tautology, they are stuck. There are, of course, ways of responding to both of these criticisms. In response to the first one, we can accept that there is not a precise logical formulation of what verifiable means, but nonetheless that we can see clear cases of verifiable statements and, more importantly, unverifiable statements. There will be edge cases, but the verificationist can say that we'll deal with those if and when they arise. For the second criticism, we can say that the verification principle is not a literal claim about the world, but instead we can reframe it as giving a piece of linguistic advice. If we want to understand the world better, then we should not recognize unverifiable claims as meaningful. We could alternatively define literally meaningful as either verifiable or tautological. This would make the verification principle true by definition, in a slightly unsatisfactory way. But whatever the potency of the criticisms of verificationism, they are often used to pretend that there is no insight to be found here. And I think that's a shame. Because even if the verificationist struggles to outright say that unverifiable claims are meaningless, there is undeniably something behind this intuition that the statements seem philosophically dodgy, and we might still want to exclude them from philosophy altogether. We could do this in a number of different ways. We could say that making such claims will be fruitless, because we'll have no way of knowing whether they're right. We could, like the verificationist, argue that we cannot pin down a definite meaning for the statements in question. But however we do it, the intuition will not go away. And I cannot help but think that the anti-verificationist has managed to criticize the letter, but ignore the spirit of the verification principle. The overall verificationist spirit is one that prioritizes logical reasoning and clear thinking. It is deeply skeptical of metaphysical claims made without any sort of empirical evidence, and it urges us to not let philosophy stray too far from what is practical. Something that is often ignored about Ayer's book is how often he justifies his approach on the basis that it makes philosophy more useful to the world. It guards against the tendency to wander off into semi-spiritual pondering and forces us to be precise about what we mean and unrelenting in our commitment to clarity and logical reasoning. It is the ultimate antidote to the kind of faux-deep pseudo-philosophy that can creep into our thoughts if we're not too careful. It doesn't matter who you are, we can all benefit from clearer thinking. And if you want something completely different to cleanse your palate, then check out this video for my analysis of Dostoevsky's White Nights, a brilliant anti-romantic love tale. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.